Good evening. I'm the Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, and I am professor of Bible and director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'd like to welcome you to our event this evening, Back to School, Race, Faith, and COVID-19. This event is sponsored by the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership and the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. And it's another in these wonderful series that we've been having at Union Presbyterian Seminary this summer, looking at the impact of race, particularly as we deal with the impacting, these two impacting crises, the COVID-19 dilemma and the George Floyd uprisings. These various crises have exposed in significant ways concerns about race. We've been talking more about race, I think, in the last 6 months than we've probably talked about in years before, as we've come to recognize the inevitability that we have to deal with race as a nation. It's costing people their lives, it's changing people's livelihoods, it's making a significant impact on the way that people live. And you can actually predict quite differently people's outcomes in life based on the color of their skin. As we've seen this particular crisis unfold, as we've looked at COVID, one of the first things that became apparent is that African Americans were impacted to a much larger extent than white Americans. We looked at this in terms of underlying health issues. African Americans are more likely to have diabetes, hypertension, asthma, and other health concerns that might contribute to their susceptibility to this disease, might contribute to their demise at the end of this disease as well. But the longer we looked, the more we saw that there were deeper underlying economic concerns as well. That COVID-19 exposed the fact that in America, we are living in two different worlds, that Black and brown people don't experience healthcare in the same way as white Americans, in part because we don't experience the economic benefits of this society in the same way. The conversation we're going to have tonight is going to look at these concerns as well, but it will take a look at another contributing factor. In addition to the concerns that we see with George Floyd and the disparities we see in policing, in addition to the disparities that we've seen in healthcare with COVID-19, the COVID-19 crisis has also produced other and brought other concerns to the forefront. So for example, tonight we're going to wrestle with the disparities that we see in the educational system. This became apparent pretty soon after we were all put on quarantine in March. One of the things that we noticed early on is when children were sent home and expected to participate in classes by platforms like Zoom, we found that there were great disparities in who had access to educational resources at home. Did people have high-speed technologies, access to the internet, Wi-Fi in their home or not? Did people have computers in their house? If there were multiple children, were there multiple computers where they could all gain access? The children who were at home, did they have parents who were able to supervise their educational process or not? All of these factors, as well as those that we've seen in health and policing, also demonstrate the disparities that exist along racial lines in America. So we really want to spend some time tonight digging into these, and this will be the first in another series that will look at the impact of race and COVID on other factors in our society. Tonight, I'm pleased that we have a wonderful panel of people that will help us look at this particular concern from different perspectives. As we go on tonight, I'm going to have introduce themselves and have them begin to answer the first question for this evening in a second, but I will introduce to you Dr. Dorothy Charles, Mr. Clayton Jordan, and Dr. Karen Marie Yust, and we'll go in that order as we progress. But as we introduce ourselves tonight, I want to simply ask everyone to give us their name, their place of service, so where do you work, what do you do in your day-to-day service, and then what brings you to this conversation? Why is this something that interests you, that you have an expertise in? And if you could answer those three brief questions, name, place where you work, what brings you to this conversation, and answer that in relationship to the first question that we'll look at tonight. And that first question is simply this. And I'm going to ask that Aaron will type this into the chat just in case you want to take a look back at the question before you go on. What are the racial disparities that you notice in your field, which have become apparent due to this pandemic? What are the racial disparities that you've noticed in your field that have become apparent during this pandemic? We'll start with you, Dr. Charles.
Thank you so much. And thank you for those opening statements. I mean, you took essentially the words out of my mouth for your first question. Um, so again, my name is Dorothy Charles. I'm a second year family medicine resident in Peoria, Illinois. And what brings me to this conversation is that I've been doing some level of anti-racism work since I've been in medical school. Um, Mike Brown was murdered like right before I started medical school. And so that really shaped my experience and made me more politically activated. And I helped organize this national die-in of medical students at the time. And from there, helped to found White Coats for Black Lives. And so um, within medicine in particular, I spend quite a bit of time thinking about and talking about racial health inequities, not just like what those disparities are in like statistics, but also like some of the underlying issues that Dr. Sadler already mentioned. So when you ask like what are the racial disparities that I've noticed as a resident physician, obviously, we have this national data about the infection rate and the mortality rate being higher, particularly in Black communities, but also other communities of color. And that disparity, like Dr. Sadler was saying, is not just driven by underlying I guess like health, like disease burden on like Black and Brown populations, but we have to think further than that, like what predisposes Black and Brown people to have higher rates of hypertension and diabetes and asthma. And a lot of that stems from underlying like policy issues from, this 400-year legacy of slavery. And that kind of cascades into the health outcomes and like the life expectancy even for Black people in particular. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles. How about we go to move over to you, Carlton?
Hi, I'm Clayton Jordan. I'm a consultant in secondary. I work with principals, I work with teachers. Currently, or I should say in the last school year, I was primarily in the Bronx. I was in Jersey City, I was in Newark and DC. We work primarily with kids who need us most. I thought for sure after I graduated with a master's degree, I was going to go on, and I had applied for further study. And I ran into a professor of mine who said, you didn't go into this work for people who didn't need you. You went into this work for those who did. And I think it kind of stuck with me. And so I ended up interviewing and then getting a job in Montclair, New Jersey. And it's a district that's known for its diversity and known to have wealthy Black folks, wealthy white folks, poor white folks, poor Black folks, just a mix, primarily white and Black. But once you get into the school, or at least the high school, you would see that they were all Black classes and all white classes. The building was tracked to the hilt. It wasn't necessarily the story of the community, which I think also won an award for by Interrace magazine for just the interracial couples, the connection that people had across races, crossing borders. But again, once you got into the school, it was very tracked. And so when I joined, the English department had voted 100%, all of the English teachers, to detrack the 9th grade. We had designs, of course, to go on and detrack the others, but we were stopped in our tracks. But we did pretty good work. We were able to get a number of Black students who normally would not be on the AP track into the AP track. And then, because we couldn't leave things alone, we were invited or given an opportunity to create a middle school. And we decided that if we did a middle school, it would start without any tracks. And so we sent letters to all the elementary schools that fed into the middle schools. And we wanted to know students who spoke a lot, who didn't speak a lot, who was shy, who was creative. And we used a lot of different measures in order to make sure that we had a mixture of students. And I'm proud to say they've gone on. This has been a while, but they've gone on. One of my favorite stories is a young man who created a school in the mountains of Peru. So the idea was to really change the way they thought about service, and also to bring in rigor. As I travel around now, I'd say disparity-wise, I mean, there's the obvious one about buildings and facilities, particularly as we think of reentry. If we think of how we social distance in some of our schools when they're already packed to the hilt, or when windows don't open, or we don't have AC that works, we know all of that. So that is, I think, a major piece here. But the underlying piece beneath that, the part that we can't see, I would argue, is teacher quality, and it's also assignments. When I worked with Ed Trust, we had this saying, a student can do no better than the assignments they're given. If we give them low-level assignments, they'll do low-level assignments. We believe, and I continue to believe this, when we give them high-level assignments with adequate supports, they show up. And for a while, the research, the data is pretty clear. When we look at the students, or the teachers who are teaching the students who need the most, even in schools that do well, the stronger teachers go to the AP classes. The kids who need those folks who are strong teachers usually don't get them. And the same holds true for schools. And so again, I would argue disparity-wise, it's the teacher quality piece, making sure that everybody has their fair share of strong teachers who have a deep content knowledge and a love for the students. And then the assignments, that we're asking kids to engage in assignments that tell their stories, that don't sugarcoat, that don't leave out, but actually begin to fill in the history so that they feel like they belong in the class. And I think once we do those, we find that students really then begin to show us who they really are.
Amen. Thank you so much, Mr. Jordan. My colleague, Dr. Yust.
Thanks, Rodney. So I'm Karen Marie Yust, and in addition to teaching Christian education and spirituality at Union Presbyterian Seminary, I am also the chair of the International Association of Children's Spirituality, and I've been studying the faith practices of children and families for over 20 years. I'm currently working on a project that involves interviewing congregational leaders across the U.S. to learn how they're ministering with children during the pandemic and what resources their congregations are offering parents to help them talk about the pandemic, and also talk about the anti-racism protests that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd. In my spare time, or not so spare time, I regularly lurk on social media sites where parents are sharing their anxiety about students returning to schools or not returning, and their exhaustion as they negotiate the uncertainties and the inequities of life circumstances and social support systems. And I've also been studying digital culture and spirituality for several years, and the pandemic has raised all kinds of new questions about the positive and negative effects of digital culture on children's lives. From these perspectives, I've noticed a couple of things, particularly related to that research I've been doing with congregational leaders. One thing is that leaders of white middle-class congregations tend to see children and families nowadays in terms of simple social support. Many of these leaders focus on encouraging individual families to use what they think of as their sort of purchasing power to buy solutions, from internet upgrades and more computer equipment to online camps and private teachers. All these things that if you have financial means, you can ease the stress of being a parent, teleworker, homeschool teacher, aging parent caregiver all at once that the pandemic is causing. And many of these ministry leaders are particularly concerned with reducing the feelings of guilt and inadequacy and fear that they perceive are part of their white middle-class congregations' experiences. Several of these leaders have told us that the anti-racism protests, they think, aren't that big an issue for their families. although they say that most of them are sympathetic, and they use that word, to the Black Lives Matter cause and movement. In contrast of what these congregational leaders are saying, I see that many white parents are aware of the racial inequities within their school districts and among school systems, particularly those who are posting material on social media sites about their concerns. These parents are trying to figure out how to keep their children safe and educationally successful, while they're also wondering how to help everyone else's children be safe and successful. And they're unsure how to make that happen. They don't like that their school leaders don't seem to be taking either safety or equity very seriously, that there seems to be a lot of politics involved and not necessarily a real concern for children and families in the community. Some of the parents I'm seeing, particularly like those here in Richmond, are taking their children to Monument Avenue, where all those Confederate statues have stood for a very long time. And they are showing their children the graffiti, and they're talking with them about why Confederate statues need to come down, and they're treating it as a learning opportunity. And some of them are even participating in protest marches. But they don't necessarily understand just how inequitable the school systems are. And if pushed, most of them do say that they would choose their own child's well-being over the well-being of other people's children. Probably not surprising to most parents listening in, but they're bothered by what they perceive to be the inequity of internet access and educational support for different families. They hear about these on news shows and on social media sites, and they really do want to know what they could do to help change things. But a lot of the solutions, like the pandemic pods that parents can put together to hire a teacher or do these supports, those are attractive to them because they don't see any other solutions at hand.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Yust, you sort of led right into my next question for you all. And this has to do with, I think, a concern, the tension that exists right now within parents. So my own daughter, I've got a 17-year-old daughter who's supposed to enter her senior year. Her mother and I are very much concerned about her going back into the classroom as the numbers are spiking here in Charlotte, North Carolina. As we're going through a second wave, as it were, of this pandemic, and it doesn't seem as though it's getting any better. But we're talking about opening up schools, even for a limited period of time at the beginning of school. And then how do I balance that with what my daughter says? My daughter says, you know, Dad, I want to go back to school. I want to be able to see my friends. I want to meet my teachers. I want to, even if it's only for 2 days, be able to spend that time there. I feel disconnected. I feel it's difficult to learn in this context. How do parents balance those sort of competing values as we weigh what do we do in the midst of this pandemic? Let me start with you, Dr. Charles.
That's a really difficult question. And I think, especially as someone who doesn't have children, it's even more difficult for me to, address, because that conflict is very different. But even from like the hospital side of things, we are seeing an uptick in particular of like mental health issues. And that's kind of me just anecdotally speaking. But like, we are social creatures. We want to be in community, and the shelter in place orders that have been going on around the country, on and off around the country, just like makes it more difficult to manage things like depression, for sure, with the isolation, anxiety, especially with something so uncertain like this virus that we know relatively little about. And for some people, it leads to like relapses in substance use, and for some other people in withdrawals. And so it's really a tough balance. And I don't know that there's a perfect answer for how to address like the psychological concerns, because on the other hand, we do know that the medical concerns are very real and very can be like permanent, right? Like the risk of mortality is not trivial. And it's so unpredictable to know who will necessarily get sick, who will need ICU level care versus mild symptoms that can be managed at home versus, succumbing to the virus and the complications related to it. And so, I think it's just a difficult decision for like anybody to make in terms of like how much am I willing to risk someone's like medical and physical well-being while also meeting their psychological needs. And I think especially with so much uncertainty about the virus, with we have a society that doesn't value community good as much as individual good, where we have a limited number of resources, and whether we like it or not, how we manage those resources as a country is very will have an impact on individuals. Like that's fundamentally how our society works. And so like if I were a parent, I think that, the possibility of my child like going to school and contracting the virus, even if the child has mild symptoms, bringing it home, exposing the parents, exposing other siblings, exposing grandma and grandpa, exposing other people in the community, I think that's a much bigger risk, especially if you know that, even healthy people can succumb to the virus, people without underlying medical conditions that they're aware of, being previously healthy and then weeks later passing away. Like that, I feel like that is such an urgent and tangible concern that we can make ways to meet some of that community and psychological need. Like Zoom parties are not the most fun. It's not the same as meeting up in person, but if that's what you need to do to accommodate some of like your children's needs, I think that would be an appropriate response. I think definitely opening up schools right now is not a good idea. Children are notorious for being little vectors of disease. I cannot imagine any child or teenager who'd want to keep a mask on for an 8-hour day at school, or even abbreviated school periods for like 4 hours. It's something that's difficult as an adult. And so to expect our children to behave in ways that we cannot live up to ourselves and putting them and other people we know and love at risk, I think is just not a gamble I'm willing to make. And I think that favoring protecting from a physical medical perspective is kind of the way to go at this point in what we know about the disease.
Can I just jump in and underscore something that Dr. Charles said a little earlier too, which is this, we tend to emphasize our individual rights and desires over that of community. And this is really a time for parents to be talking with children and youth and young adults about the value of community. We wear a mask not because it protects us, but it protects others. Maybe it protects us some, but mostly it's about protecting others because we might be asymptomatic and carrying the virus, and we can't know that. So faith communities and parents can be really talking about the importance of considering the human family, considering the community and the value to the community, and what are we willing to give up for the good of the community. That's an important spiritual and faith message that we need to be reinforcing nowadays.
Mr. Jordan, did you want to jump in on this?
Sure, I would just echo again the community aspect of it. I'm thinking of some research by Arlene Geronimus. She has this incredible research called Weathering. She was asked to look at why young women of color were getting pregnant during schools. And so she goes in, she does the research, and as it continues, she finds out that they're unable in large numbers to carry to term without complications as they get older. So eventually, as she's doing this, we come up with this term weathering. And in a conversation I had with a colleague of mine, she said it this way. we were talking about race.
Mhm.
She looked me in the face as the lone black man at the table, and she said, white people age, black people weather. And that struck me. I thought about it for a minute, and I said, say that again. And she said, white folks age, black people weather. And so when we think of all these underlying conditions, we know that racism and the stress, we're seeing it in the news. You're walking into your apartment, someone stops you, you're in the middle of Central Park just wanting to watch birds and you get stopped. It's all these things over and over and over that sort of hit the body. For years, I used to say, my mother was such a strong woman, she could take anything. And it just had this image of strength. And it isn't until now that I realize that there's a price for that, that even when you don't show it, something happens at the cellular level. And so when we begin to think about the diabetes and the high blood pressure and the stress, it's all sort of coming in from everything that we get day to day. Now, as I think about that, I put myself back into the schools that I work in, where they don't have good ventilation. They're just packed to the hilt. And also, we know that New York was at the height, was the epicenter. I kept thinking, if these folks in New York, the Bronx was hit hard, what will it be like when we come back to school? There are faces behind this that have to have a moment to grieve and to deal. How do we actually do that, right? They're going to apartments where they may have one bathroom, or they may not have a lot of rooms. How do you shelter in place? So going back to this community idea, going to school where you have an opportunity to spread, and we're seeing in the news every now and then, there's a wedding party and now 18 people have COVID, or there was a beach party and 20 people have COVID-19. That's a real risk. So as we think about this, I hope we're being sensible about it, that it isn't necessarily just the folks who might have room, or they might have multiple rooms, multiple bathrooms, backyards, what have you. It's the folks who have apartment living that don't have a lot of airspace to get around. And if it doesn't, and we're finding this might not be true, I think, as was said earlier, kids are vectors of disease. They're going to take that home, and then we're going to have folks there who are older, who, again, if I go back to that notion of weathering, they might not show it right away, but all those underlying factors and everything else they face in the world, it might be a little bit too much to bear. So I think, again, we would think twice about it and consider community.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I want to take the first question from the audience tonight. And this is an elaborate question that really does bring up the reality of the differences between races economically, and what do you do as a poor family? So the question is this: how can we ameliorate the agony of a poor family who feels it necessary to return their children to school so the parents can return to work outside the home, although such return can unduly subject them to infection? This is a reality faced by so many today. How do we ameliorate that agony?
If it's okay, did I start?
Please.
The first thing that that question brings to mind, and it's something that Mr. Jordan already kind of brought up in his last response, is that poor people have already been overly exposed to the virus, right? There are stories of how when you how when the virus is hitting New York pretty hard, right? A lot of the service workers are Black and brown people. They live up in the Bronx, they live in Brooklyn, they live in Queens. Even then, you go a little past the gentrified parts, and you take the subway down into the city, and as you get closer and closer to the city, right, the trains are filling up, and then at the end of the day, the reverse happens where, you know, essentially everybody is getting off farther away from the city. And so I would almost argue that more than likely these poor families have already had to make this tough decision, or they're working jobs where they can't Zoom from home or can't just answer emails, um, or they can't afford to pay their rent, especially if their state is not, increasing unemployment benefits, if they don't already qualify for federal aid and things like that. And so they have already been making this decision, and in many cases have been making this decision for a long, long time. Like even before COVID, like the thing about COVID is that it's exposing the risks that disproportionately Black people have to take in society. And so, you know, when you ask like, how do we help a family that feels the need to like go to work or send their kids to school in order for them to go to work, right? The question is, why do they have to go to work except that they have bills to pay? Like, why are we not providing rent relief? Why don't we have like a very robust like unemployment? Um, I'm blanking on the word now, like unemployment break or whatever. Why don't we have free healthcare for
Unemployment
folks?
insurance, is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
maybe I can't recall. I'm just pulling a blank right now. It's fine. It happens.
American UB40s. There you go.
But essentially, you know, you're getting at an underlying issue here of um, poor people not having the resources they need, period. Um, and COVID is just bringing that more to light. And so, like, what can we do as like individuals? Like, that's really hard to answer because the the problem was never individual to begin with. So, like, the solutions that we're asking for are things like universal basic income, for Medicare for all, for you know, defunding and abolishing the police and moving that money back into schools and like redistributing the way we fund our public schools, right? Because that's based off of property taxes. How do we address issues of redlining, which has a long history and is so much responsible for like some of the issues that Mr. Jordan was discussing about, you know, buildings not having heat or air conditioning. I went to medical school in Philly, and like very routinely, you know, you find out that there's asbestos in our schools, in our public schools. Our schools don't have heat, and like Philly is not as cold as like Minnesota, but it's, you know, it gets cold. And I would not want to be, how can you learn in an environment where you're not even comfortable? Um, these are like fundamental issues that require like governmental policy interventions, and how to like push that in this moment. Like right now, I think protests are one of the few ways where we're like actually making change. I'm like very much a proponent um, of activism, direct action, because that gets the goods. That puts pressure on politicians who otherwise are just like writing bills and arguing over their content, and nitpicking over crumbs when we are asking for a whole loaf of bread. So that's kind of my perspective, at least on the topic.
Thank you.
I would just note too, for those middle-class white parents who are out there trying to figure out, okay, how can I help? And what immediately comes to mind is, oh, I could give food to a food pantry, or I could give clothes to someplace. And certainly there continue always to be needs for those sorts of things. But in this moment where Congress is looking at a second stimulus package and all kinds of things are being said about, you know, giving money, increased unemployment benefits means people won't go back to work, or that we don't want to extend the moratoriums on evictions or these kinds of things, that these middle-class white parents can go to the bat and say, this is not my understanding of how families are thinking and how other parents are thinking. The idea that either we have to go back to school or we don't go back to school, versus looking at a whole host of other kinds of ways that we might address children's education, so that we don't have these binary choices, but we in fact look at the ways that it's time to be advocating, that this is the time for political action. This is the time to talk about defunding the police really means providing services of other sorts that police are not well trained to do, that we have other people trained to do this. And so rather than thinking in terms of the same old, provide a few goods and hope for the best, this is really about changing policies. And so that's what I think white congregations need to get active about, moving their families towards this kind of advocacy, because otherwise you really don't address the real issues.
And the part that I think white families don't want to necessarily deal with, right, is that in order to make society more equitable, like we are literally redistributing wealth. Yes, that probably means more for Jeff Bezos than like the average like white middle class family, and he needs to pay taxes, period, right? But the fact that, like Dr. Yust was saying earlier about if it were up to white families, if they're pushed to it, the choice to send their kids to a better school, right? Let's not, get into interrogating what that even means to begin with, but um, if it's the choice of sending their kids to a better school versus, staying at a school that may not be as considered as good, but staying and like making sure that your kid gets a quality in education, and that in turn will also mean that the Black kid down the street from you also gets a same quality education. Like that is something that does not exist in the white imagination, right? And again, that it boils back to this idea of like individualism at the expense of the community. And um, I I don't have an answer for like how to deal with that, except that it's going to be hard and difficult and scary, and it may not seem fair in the way that white folks often consider fairness, but it's what's just and what needs to happen if we are to right this like very um old harm.
Amen. And one of the things I'd say, just in response to that question myself, is that things have never been fair. So to assume that they will be automatically fair in this instance is also problematic. Perhaps this gives us another instance where we can begin to note the unfair nature of the current system and begin to seek solutions, find other ways to deal with these concerns. So just my little offering in this larger question. The next question from the audience is this: how might this crisis moment impact the spirituality, faith, and mental health of our children and our youth? Dr. Yust, let me start with you.
Well, one of the things we know is that for a lot of young people, there's a great deal of anxiety that comes with any kind of disruption of routine and a sort of sense of crisis. And I actually want to just share some of what I saw. I read things that are that young people write or that young people are sharing. And there was a great article in Teen Vogue, not my usual reading as an academic, but an interesting place to find out what young people are thinking, that talked about issues, particularly for young people of color. But crossing over various groups, and that young people, particularly students of color, are really worried about relatives getting laid off and the mounting bills there. And some of them are even worried they're going to have to defer their college education in order to get jobs to help support families. Young people whose parents have mixed immigration status. Those families were left out of the stimulus relief packages. And so they're, struggling. That there are children of at all kind of economic who are having to take on greater responsibilities at home in terms of elder care or care of younger children in order to help parents or caregivers who are trying to manage the work from home or going out to work and the dangers there that's going on. And then, of course, as it's already been mentioned, there are inequities of funding in our schooling systems, and young people are aware of that. And they don't have people to talk to. I mean, a lot of young people, even fairly young children, recognize their parents' stress levels are rising, and they don't know where to turn to talk about those anxieties. So so we could say, if we think of spirituality as not necessarily even religious, but about that kind of spirit of a child that is that creates a sense of well-being and connection and belonging, that's under strain right now. And so it's not enough to to just say, well, we're all stressed, and need to create opportunities for other, to be Zooming or, online with other people if that's possible, or having those socially distanced connections where people can talk about how their family's coping. We need to have faith leaders who are helping define some of these issues and explain, offer language for how to talk about them with young people, and then engage families in opportunities to do just that with one another, whether it's in drive-in church, or it's on a Facebook chat if people have access to that, or again, if it's just saying, getting people together to go for a socially distanced walk around the neighborhood, and to remind them that there's presence there. But anxiety is really the major spiritual issue here, and uncertainty about the future, anxiety about the economics of it, and children as young as 8 or 9 really pick up on parental anxieties about economic concerns. So we need to provide opportunities for them to know, 1, they're not alone, 2, that although we don't have the answers, we're all looking for them together, and 3, that there are communities, and in the case of my research, faith communities, that will try to help them stand together even when the going gets tough.
Thank you.
I agree with Dr. Yust. And from a school perspective, a public school perspective, I'll say it that way, we'll think there's some interesting work going on around social emotional. And I was fortunate enough to do a school review in the spring, and we thought it was a school that the organization that I consult with works with, and we thought all of those would be sort of done with, because obviously school, particularly on the north end, was cut short. But they continued, and this one school decided that for the virtual learning, they would only do advisory for the first week. And advisory means a whole host of things, but for the most part, it's students talking to their advisors, they're thinking things through. And that school was on the cutting edge to say, we're not worried about what essay is due, we're not going to worry about what books you didn't read, or we're not going to worry about all of this. Let's just come and talk and process. And when the time was right, we do activities to get your mind off of things because you're living it at the moment. And then there were moments when you would talk about it. Now, interestingly enough, when I did this school review, and the school review took place, I think it was in late May, they were at the top of attendance for distance learning, virtual learning. They were at the top. Now, the district didn't really keep real attendance because everybody else was doing so miserably. But I think something was happening there that they were able to say to the students, when we think of social emotional learning and we think of those 4 academic mindsets: I belong in this community, this work has meaning for me, if I work hard, effort, I can do it, and I belong here. If I look at the 2, I belong here and this has meaning for me, that advisory did just that. And I would say on an emotional, social emotional sort of range, if we start school not with, I need you to read this in 2 days, or we need to do these 20 problems, or something about history, but if we start really looking at the social emotional connections and getting students a chance to talk about what they're feeling, how they're sort of making it, in some cases, how they're surviving, how their parents are sort of negotiating, or caregivers, whoever it is that's in the home, I think something else happens. It then says that the school is my space, and it shifts the ground. So it isn't right and wrong answer. It's how do I make sense of the data that's before me? And then whether that data becomes a novel or a short story or a particular perspective of history, I now know the teacher believes that I'm worthy and I'm interesting enough to give my opinion and to interact with it. And I would argue up until this point, we don't teach that way. Everything, there's a right and there's a wrong. You didn't read, you get penalized. You didn't do these 20, you get penalized. We never really wonder or question why so you didn't do X. And so I think there are ways to think about it. So I would say on a social emotional end, if we begin to look at making sure kids feel like they belong in the community, which now means it has to be their community and not whatever the curricular pacing guide is. But we take time to move some of that stuff back for the first 3 or 4 weeks. That when they're coming back, we give them a chance to process. And we can process through journals. We can do the still reading and the writing and all of that. We can look at stories, as was mentioned. We can look at the story in Teen Vogue. What are they feeling? Is it your story? Is it the same? Is it different? Why? So all those questions. And then that shapes the ground. So when we're ready to run and they're building community. And I would argue too, when it comes to Zooming, it's the same way we might do it in class. I might have a small group before I go large. I can group students together, small groups. I can figure out what those sort of home spaces are, the ones they connect with, that they always need to be together for the first 10, 15 minutes, and really begin to shape. I think this is an opportunity in all the chaos to try to figure out how we move further. And I would argue that all of the big moments throughout history have been moments to shake things up because we were moving along and it was never inclusive. Whether we think of the Civil War or we think of the Civil Rights, Black Power movement, or we think of Women Liberations movement, or we think of September 11th. These big moments came, we shook for a while, and we all decided we had to do better. And that lasted for a little bit, and then we revert back. But I think if we take these young people that we have in front of us, who are looking at the news and seeing that young people are the change, a diverse group of people are saying enough is enough. You folks couldn't get it right when you had it. And I think if we think about education and creating that emotional, social emotional space that prepares them to join the wave, I think then we can make movement and bring them along and engage them.
Let me just jump in too and add that we also need to, I think we talk about social distancing in part because we have this negative view of digital culture. And so we have mistaken physical distancing for an inability to be social. And young people actually know quite a bit about how to be social in digital culture. So I think we need to look to them to help us understand how we maintain and build social community and social relationships online, and how that then helps mitigate some of what we miss in terms of physical distancing, because I think it's much harder on folks of our age, those of us on this panel, than it is on young people. There are still things they very much miss, but there's a lot they know about how to connect online. And when we use that language of social distancing, and I realize that's kind of, public health policy, we're really talking about physical distancing and rethinking the ways we engage socially. And so maybe we need to ask young people to help us think about how to do that better.
Amen. I want to say thank you for that. And my 17-year-old daughter could teach me volumes about how to be social, even though at distance. As another question that's come in from the audience, this from the Reverend soon-to-be Dr. Lori Archer-Rabel. I'm going to truncate your question if you don't mind. What do we do looking at the crises that poorer families are going to have as they move towards these difficult decisions? Send my child to school so I can go to work, support the family, maintain housing, et cetera, et cetera. What can we do as members of churches that have more resources and more means to help offset the burden that these families bear?
One thing that comes to mind is sending children to school the only solution that a church could support? Churches provide other ways of supporting children's educational success without requiring them to be in that school building if distancing, et cetera, isn't possible in that particular setting. So could churches be places that expand the real estate for schools? Could we use church buildings to make larger classrooms where children can be more distant? Can we, in areas where we have appropriate weather, could they even provide outdoor spaces where classes might be held? So some of it is, rethinking what are the possibilities. But I think, providing physical spaces can, in cases where a parent might be able to reduce their hours somewhat and therefore reduce their child's exposure, could churches make up lost income or provide resources that help with that. I mean, I think we have to, again, start thinking outside the usual boxes. But the first question would be to ask, can the church provide a way for that child to successfully receive an education that doesn't require them to have to be in the school building if the school building is not particularly safe?
And I would add that I think even as we're thinking about redefining the physical space for instruction, I think we should move upstream back to the source of instruction and ask this simple question. If we are virtual, why are we still thinking in a physical building or a physical time for virtual? If we go virtual, I think we've got to have a little bit more of a healthy imagination and begin to think things through. What would it be like if we did schooling, at least in the sections of virtual, like case studies, that I need you to check in at a certain amount of at a certain time, and you might be able to check in at 7:30 at night. If some of the tools that we use are recorded, we have the supports, the scaffolding there to help students through, or you might not necessarily have to be with a particular teacher who's free this time. So I think as we're thinking about virtual, let's not lock in to 7:30 to 2:30. Let's try to imagine what that could possibly be like, which in and of itself would even probably be amenable to teachers who have students and young kids that they're trying to figure out, particularly if their school says they have to be in the building, but the school where the children go says, no, you're virtual. There are ways to think this through. So I think as we have an opportunity, we have a chaotic moment to think through it with all of the thinking that we can muster, that would be equitable for all kids and their families.
I think an interesting theme I'm hearing, especially with this question, but overall, is this idea of needing imagination to come up with new solutions. And I think that's interesting because children inherently learn that way, right? Like they are curious, they ask questions. And I'm not an educator and I won't pretend to be, but just thinking about, my schooling and growing up and what are the most effective ways that I've learned over time? What information has stuck with me over time? And a lot of it ends up being like some of the self-directed stuff, the random things that you pick up just because you're curious about it. And when we talk also about this younger generation already being more accustomed to like social media and connecting with other people online, you can even think about more ways to innovate with even the curriculum, and how to allow for some level of like self-exploration for like creative assignments and prioritizing those sorts of forms of expression, um, as part of this virtual curriculum. Obviously, I'm sure that there are plenty of educators who have thoughts and feelings about that, and they've been incorporating it into their classrooms probably for a while now, but I think the virtual learning probably takes that to a new level.
Well, thank you all. I want to get to the last question because we're almost out of time for today, and we can try to do this as quickly as possible, but it is unfortunately an involved question. I love this notion that crisis presents opportunity. Crisis presents an opportunity to re-examine what we're doing, to think about new ways to do things, et cetera, et cetera. As we look at the disparities that exist in our current educational system, how might we begin to utilize this as an opportunity to make a more just, fair system that truly does provide an equal opportunity for learning for all of our students? Who'd like to go first?
I'll go first. I'll be quick. Two things come to mind. First, I think one of the things we have to do is to teach an honest history and to teach an honest literary experience. Those two, I mean, I think schooling has been plagued by absence and erasure. Students come along and they believe, because they've never been taught, that African American, Native American, Asian American writers don't exist. Latino writers don't exist. Thinkers don't exist. When we think about the sort of the beginning of the country, and I'm not going 1619, I'm going to go sort of at that point when we were said to sort of be a country, there were those two groups here, the Native American, the African American group. And from that point on, we don't hear anything. We need to hear about their resilience. We need to hear about how they fought back. We need to hear about their patriotism. We need to hear about their brilliance. All of that reframes how we sort of think about the world when we get to the sort of the 12th grade. It's a more honest, a more robust. And I would argue we also have to know about the terror. We have to know about the difficulty, the hard stories that no one wants to talk about. We have to hear those because in those come hope and they come resilience. The other thing I want to say quickly is when I worked with that team in Montclair, when we detracked the ninth grade, ninth grade English, we were very aware of the fact that we would teach kids who had read very little novels in middle school, who had written very few papers. And I taught a student who eventually got 1,600 on the SATs, had read almost every Dickens novel imaginable before she got to ninth grade. So that just gives you the wide range of just confidence. And so what we did was we actually had a group of people in the town who created what they call the writer's room. These were writers, these were business people, these were church folks who had time on their hands to volunteer. So for me, every Friday was a writing workshop day. I had 4 extra bodies in the room when I was giving feedback to the students. And it was paid for through the district and money here and there. I would think that when we think, what can churches do? What can we do in the outside? I imagine virtual writers' rooms. As folks are, and I take it a step further, if you know that within schools they're reading X or they're studying X in history, there become almost virtual centers in these places where there are a few people in the buildings that'll say, okay, they're doing this in world history now, I'll focus on this. And suddenly you become a call center, not necessarily a tutorial, but a place that just reinforces. So those are the 2 things I would say. I think if we think about what it is we're teaching, how we teach and we tell the story, and then on the other, we take the talents that we have that never go inside a building and we enlarge the teaching space in the churches, in the community houses, in the support banks, feed banks, whatever they are, I think would be a wonderful way to sort of support those students who don't have as much as others do.
Thank you.
Yeah, just very, very briefly, I would say collaboration. We are seeing that it truly does take a village to do anything during this pandemic. And so this is a chance for us to really think, as Ms. Jordan was saying, about the collaborations that we do. And as Dr. Charles was saying, the imaginative possibilities of those collaborations. So if we were going to move forward, we're going to have to collaborate in imaginative ways.
Thank you.
I guess the one thing I think of in terms of addressing educational disparities is to really look into how your local public schools are funded. I think a lot of Americans are not always aware of exactly how we pay for our schools, how that's distributed, why certain districts have more resources than others. And I think this is an opportunity as individuals to educate ourselves about redlining as a formal policy to create housing segregation, and also see how that connects to health, right? The disproportionate rates of asthma among, Black and Brown children stem in part from the ways that neighborhoods have been divided by highways, or where certain factories or industrial plants are located. And so the issues of education and health and literal physical space, in a time where we're thinking so much about physical distancing and physical space, you should also be thinking about how the spaces we exist in came to be created and what we need to do to reverse that. And in many ways, that isn't something that we can address as individuals, but I think starting with individual awareness is kind of how you get the ball rolling in terms of moving toward activism and policy change.
Well, good. Well, thank you. Thank you for that answer, Dr. Charles, and thank you all for your answers tonight. It's been a wonderful panel. I want to say thank you again to Dr. Dorothy Charles, Mr. Clayton Jordan, and Dr. Karen Marie Yust for being with us tonight, for sharing your insights, your wisdom as we wrestle with this issue that's on all of our minds at this point in time. I remember speaking, I serve as the co-chair of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Systems Superintendent's Religious Advisory Committee. And one of the things I remember talking to the superintendent about is the need to find a way to promote greater equality. This is our moment to begin to shift the larger system. We have the potential for equality with educational platforms. If we can find a way to promote equality in educational platforms, equality here, we might be able to make a significant shift in all of our school systems across our country. Well, this is a conversation that will continue going forward as we wrestle with these issues of race in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of the uprising, in the midst of a time when we know we need to make significant changes if we are to truly be that country where everyone is considered created equal and endowed with equal rights by our Creator. I want to thank you all for joining us on behalf of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership and the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. I just want to say thank you for joining us. Please join us again. God bless you all, and good night.
Thanks, Rodney. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.